Hey guys, and welcome to another DRD tutorial. Today we're going to be taking a look at how we can program up our own polyphonic frequency modulation based synthesizer using Max for Live inside of Ableton Live. So this is not a rehearsed or overproduced video. It's going to be kind of a long one because we're going to really talk about everything along the way, and I'm going to make a few mistakes so you can kind of see what it's actually like to be programming something inside of Max for Live and how to work through all of that, and we're going to end up with something that kind of sounds like what you're hearing now. So buckle in, strap up, let's get going. Alright, let's begin by cleaning up our set, getting rid of the things that we don't need, any of these audio tracks, any of these return tracks. I just like to do that because I like a clean slate to begin working with. And then the next thing we'll do is we'll go into our browser, go to Max for Live, and there's three different types of Max for Live effects or instances. We have Max Audio Effects, and we've got the default here at the top of the folder. If I drag and drop that into a track here, see it loads up a new track there, and we've got audio input on one side and audio output on the other side. So a Max Audio Effect receives and sends audio along. If we go back to our browser and we load up a Max Instrument, you can see that it receives MIDI. We see our MIDI meter on one side and then an audio meter on the other side. Meter on the other side. So we can then understand that that's receiving MIDI, and then somehow inside of there we're going to translate MIDI into audio and pass along audio. The final instance of Max Instruments or Max stuff in here is the Max MIDI effect that we can assume receives MIDI and sends MIDI. So those are kind of our three default starting places for building up a Max for Live anything. So we're going to start with the Max Instrument because we want to be able to receive MIDI and send out audio. We're going to be building a synthesizer here. So now that we've got that default loaded up onto a MIDI track, we can go ahead and crack open or launch Max so that we can start editing this patch, and do that by clicking on the edit button there. We can see that I am not recording. Am I recording? I am recording. Good. Looks like I had a few things going there. We can get rid of all those old patches. I must have improperly closed it out last time. And now we've got our patch open and I've just expanded it out. I'm not going to be going into detail in this video about navigating or the basics of Max. There's plenty of other videos out there on that. In this one we're going to be talking all about just building our frequency modulation synthesizer. So let's start by cleaning things up. We can see that Max has labeled some things for us here. That we've got our MIDI from Live, which is coming in through this object, the MIDI in object, and then it's prompting us, build your instrument here. How exciting. And then at the bottom here we've got our plug out, which sends out our stereo output channels from it. Another important thing is we can see our device height limit here, vertical limit there. So we've got from this line to that line of space that we can fill that's going to be visible when we move back into Ableton. We'll talk about how to prepare all that space and make it look pretty towards the end of this video. So let's start by cleaning things up. I don't want all these comment boxes. I like a nice, neat workspace to work with, and now we're good to go. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is translate our MIDI input signal. So we're receiving all of our raw MIDI messages in through this MIDI in. So there's two different types of objects that can actually receive MIDI inside of Max. There's the MIDI in object, and there's also the note in object. I've found that the MIDI in is a little bit more reliable, although a little bit more complex. The note in is a little bit more simplistic in that it's already kind of prepped some of this data or sorted through some of this data for us. So you can see there's pitch, there's velocity, and there's the MIDI channel. So a little bit more simplistic in that it's just looking for note in information, where the MIDI in object is receiving all the different possible streams of MIDI data that we could be getting. And I've just found that this one's a little bit more reliable when working inside of a synthesizer, although a little bit more complex. So let's go ahead and delete that out of there. So the next thing we need to do is we need to somehow sort or parse this MIDI information. So we're going to create a new object, type in MIDI parse, and this object is responsible for receiving MIDI data. So we're going to connect up our MIDI output there, or MIDI input I should say, into our MIDI parse, and now we've got all these different boxes down here for separating out our data. And this first one is the one that we're going to need to start with, the pitch and the note, or the pitch and the velocity output there. So it's sorted everything and it's giving us just note on and note off with their pitch and velocity. So if I connect that up to an object that unpacks that data, we could give it an argument saying that I want it to unpack 2 integers, but by default that's what it's going to do, so we can just leave it in its default state. And now if I connect up underneath that some integer boxes, and the default there is just I to generate 2 integer boxes. Connect that up, stretch this out a little bit to keep things all square and even. And then if we jump back over to live, let's just program up a simple little sequence here so we can see some data flowing in and out and get that playing. Shift tab to see our devices. We can see there's MIDI data pumping out of that clip into our devices flow here and feeding into our Max instrument. Back over to Max, you can see, aha, we're getting data. And if we were to pass all that along to our Max console, we'll call this note. Connect that up there. Go to our Max console. We can see our flow of information there passing along there. What's kind of interesting to look at is if we delete that cable, so we stop that flow, is we're always getting the note on, and then a little bit while later the note off message for all of that. So we get the note on, which is the note name or the note number, plus a velocity that is anything other than 0, and then later we'll get that note off message for that same note name, which is 65, and a 0 for velocity. So that's all that's passing through this section over here. So we can actually get rid of that print for now, clear out our console, collapse it down so we don't need to look at it. And now we're ready to start using that MIDI data. So the next thing we need to do is we need to translate this MIDI message into some sort of relative frequency for our synthesizer, in that we don't want to be producing 67, 65 as our frequency, but we want to actually be getting the frequency of the note that represents. So we could actually switch this up if we wanted to. I could go to the inspector for this object here by going Command I, launches my inspector. Let's change its display format to MIDI C4, and now we can actually see the note, the MIDI note number, or the name of the pitch that we're calling up by that sequence of MIDI data that's flowing in there. So we want to get the frequency of those notes. So to do that, there's an object for it, MTOF MIDI to frequency, M2F. Drop this in here, connect it up in our signal flow. And now at the bottom there, we connect up, I've connected up a flownum or float box. The shortcut for that was just the F key over an unlocked patch gives me a flownum box, just like I gave me an integer box. And now we can see the frequency of the note that we're calling there with our sequence. Then next we'll need something that can actually generate a tone or an audio signal from that frequency. So let's create a new object, call it our cycle and a tilde. There's 2 different worlds in our Max for live stuff. Well, actually there's kind of 3.5. There's our Max world, which all these objects that we've used so far have been in the Max world, where they're just passing along control or just data, and it's all waiting for it to be prompted. It's not passing it all the time, it's only passing it when that data information changes. So in this case, it's only passing it when our sequence of notes tells it to. The second world is the MSP, or multiple signal processing world, and those are all indicated by having a tilde at the end of them. And these are exchanging data at our audio rate. So whatever our sample rate is, if we jump back into live, go into our audio preferences, we can see currently we're sampling at 44,100, which is 44,100 times per second. We're exchanging information about what is the current state of our audio network. And so in this case, this little object is going to be constantly sending out information and expecting to receive information 44,100 times per second, or whatever our current sampling rate is. So if we hover over the top, we can see that we've got 2 inputs for this object. One is the frequency input, and it can receive either a signal, so a message in the MSP world, or a float, something from the Max world. And either of those values or types of values is going to specify the frequency at which this object is going to produce a tone. One of the awesome things about working in Max is that if you ever don't know about an object, you can just simply use the shortcut Command-Shift-H or control-click on it and go to Open Cycle Help. So just open whatever this object's help file is. Sorry, not sure why that was so distorted. But we get this awesome, actually it's a max patch that tells us all about the object that we're working with. So we can see that this is a sinusoidal oscillator, so it's going to generate a sine tone at whatever frequency we tell it to. So let's get out of that box. So if I connect up our flow of data here, the MIDI in, which is parsed out to give me the note on and note off messages, we get our note message here, our velocity messages here. We translate that note name into a frequency, which passes into this box, and then we use that box to specify the frequency at which this max or this MSP object, which produces a sine tone, at which frequency that object is going to produce a sine tone. Then we're nearly there. We should also add in some volume control just while we're working in here. We might delete this out later. So I'm going to create a new object called the live.gain. Live just means it's going to look like a Ableton live object, and then gain means it's going to give me gain control. So if I hit create there, got two inputs, we'll just connect up one of the inputs, which is going to send the same signal to both sides. If I connected up another input to the right hand side, then we'd have stereo feed passing through this. Let's take that same output and connect it up. Before we do that, let's lock our patch, Command E, or click on the lock in the bottom corner there, turn the volume down there just so we don't hurt ourselves or others, and then connect up both of these patch cables. If I hold Shift before I release this patch cable, it'll allow me to create and connect multiple patch cables from the same output to multiple inputs. So release Shift before I connect the second patch cable, and now I've got that all connected up, and you can hear ever so quietly in the background there. We've got a super simple synthesizer that's creating sine tones based upon the MIDI notes that we're passing into it. So we're already making sound with just a few objects here. We've got something really awesome. So the next step here is to actually get some envelopes happening here. So right now, if I were to jump back over to live, exit out of this, hit stop. You see right now we're not playing, everything is stopped, but we're still producing the frequency, and it's just producing the frequency of the last received note here. So there's nothing that's telling this sinusoidal oscillator to stop making sound. Nothing is turning off the audio after that note off message is received. So what we need for this is an envelope to control this. A really simple version of this would be to take and multiply this signal by the velocity. If we were to multiply it by the velocity as it is right now, which is a number that ranges between 0 and 127, we'd likely blow up our ears or our speakers or our headphones, because both Max as well as Ableton is expecting the output of a signal to range between positive and -1. So if I connect this up to an oscilloscope here, and let's bring the frequency down to 1 Hertz so we can see it. This is ranging back and forth between the top of the display here is representing +1 and going down to -1. We could think of this in the world that we live and breathe in as being positive and negative air pressure, which is what audio is. If you look at your speaker, you can see it's got these big cones on it, and in the analog audio world, these are voltages that we're visualizing here, +1 voltage or -1 voltage, and what that's doing is it's actually pushing out your speaker cone at +1 or sucking it back in at -1, which in turn is causing the air molecules in front of that to move in or out, which then turns what we're seeing here or creating inside of our computer back from just being zeros and ones or kind of abstract things into actual air moving back and forth in a room that we can then experience as music or sound or whatever we're trying to create. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we're expecting, all of our systems are expecting to stay within that +1 to -1 range. So if we take and we multiply the output of this sine tone generator by a value that's going between 0 and 127, that's going to go well beyond the range that our system is expecting. So we need to translate this range down into that -1 to +1, or just 0 to 1 range. To do that, really simple, we can just create a new object, tell it to multiply divide the signal by 127 and adding a decimal point. Decimal points are really important in programming in that they specify whether or not we're expecting an integer, so whole numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so on, or floating points, so expecting decimal points after our integers. And it's really important because if I just do divide by 127, then we're only ever going to get a 0 for anything that is less than 127 and only get 1 when we're actually sending in a velocity of 127. So it's going to really limit the range of amplitudes that we can actually trigger here. So I want to have a decimal point there, that way I get all the values between 0 and 1, just like we're getting all the values between 0 and 127. So connect these up. And let's put a float box underneath that so we can see that value. Then let's get our sequence playing again. Jump back over to max. And now we can see that I'm getting numbers going back and forth between 0 and the scaled version of our 100 as velocity up there. So then the simple version of an envelope would be just simply to deconnect these. I'm holding Option and dragging over those to select those patch cables and then hit delete. So the simple version would be to just simply create a signal multiplier object, which allows us to take and multiply two signals together. First operation there is that star there, which is the equivalent of multiply, and then the second thing there is the tilde there, letting me know that this is going to be processing signals. So if we connect up our oscillator there and our value of velocity, which has been scaled to 0 or 1, and we just look at this first and foremost, we can see we're getting the signal passing through there, and then it's getting silenced when we've turned back to 0 here. So really simple envelope there that's just turning it on or off with our note on and note off messages. So if I connect that up, huzzah, we've got something that's really basic, really simple there, where it's turning it on or off. But what if I want something that's a little bit more robust? It isn't just simply on and off whenever that note begins and ends. We can do that using an ADSR object, which produces an attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope. So it's an envelope generator. So if we add that in there, we can see that this first one is expecting whatever is going to trigger it, whether this be a signal or a float, and that's expecting to receive a value between 0 and 1. If we send in a 0, it's either going to stop the envelope or tell it to move into its release stage of the envelope, or if we receive a value, any value that's greater than 0, it's going to trigger a new envelope to begin. Then these other inputs here is for our attack time, our decay time, our sustaining value, and our release time. So let's use some kind of prettier looking user interface objects here to control the shape of our envelope. So let's go live.dial, and then let's jump into the inspector for that dial. So I've just opened up my inspector window. I've got that dial selected so I can edit it, and let's change its range to be from 0. Let's potentially have some fairly long envelopes, so 0 to 5,000. And then let's change its unit style to time. And then let's establish an initial. And since this is going to be my attack, let's have it at least 5 milliseconds. And then let's change its short name to attack. Then let's take and just option drag that out twice so we can have our attack. Let's change the second one to be decay, and let's change its initial to maybe 250 milliseconds. And then this last one is going to be the release. So when my note off message is received, how long is it going to take for the amplitude of the note produced to return back to silence? So let's change this one to release, and let's change its initial to maybe 500. And then let's add in one more here, option drag it here. And this one's going to be our sustaining value. And let's change its range from 0 to 100, because we're not specifying a time, we're specifying a value range from either silent to full amplitude. And let's change its initial to 100, so we always have sustain. And let's change its display style from time to percentage. So now we've got a dial that goes from 0 to 100. And we're good to go. So now we've got something that's going to specify our attack time, so take its output, something that's going to specify our decay time, something that's going to specify our sustaining value, but remember we're expecting audio signals to range between 0 and 1, so if I specify a sustaining value of 100, which is the maximum output this dial is set to send, we're going to get a signal that's going to distort or clip inside of our digital world or blow up our speakers if nothing else fails before it gets there. So rather than connecting up this value here, I'm going to connect up the value on the right hand side, which is always going to send me a raw value output, which is just specifying where is this dial and location of its rotation as a value between 0 and 1, which is perfect. Or I could just simply divide the output of this dial by 100 and get the same results, but this is just a little bit more efficient and I don't need to create another object to do it. And then connect up the release value or release time, maybe stretch this out a little bit so we get everybody nicely connected. As always, it's just kind of the frustrating thing about using that other side there. So maybe let's just, because I'm all about neat and tidiness, let's distribute evenly horizontally. There we go. So now what this is expecting, if we connect up another scope here, and I connect up a toggle, there we can see our envelope. There's our sustaining value. If I set up some release time and I turn it off, you can see it slope back down. Set up some other values here, trigger new envelope, sweeps up, decay, down to our sustaining value, holds at the sustaining value until I send in a value that is 0, and then it will return back to, you can see here, remember this display is +1 to -1, so this is ranging from +1 to 0, right at the middle there. So now we've got an envelope generator, 3-stage or 4-stage envelope generator. We've got attack, decay, sustain, and release. And we're going to use that to multiply the output of our cycle or our tone generator here, our oscillator. So let's get rid of that toggle and let's connect up the output of this object into here, which is our 0 to 1 value based upon our velocity, then the output of that into our signal multiplier here. So we've got our tone generator coming on the left, our envelope generator coming on the right, both of them multiplying together to generate the output of our oscillator. So now if I jump back over, bring down my attack time, so one of the things that I find nice is to have exponential values in here, and that often I like to work down in this tiny time range, and then once I'm up into larger ranges, it needs to be a little bit less specific. So let's change each of these, just the time values here, to having an exponent of 3.33333, just give me more exponential. And then if I bring this down here, you can see that I've got a much smaller range there. That when I'm working in just the tens of milliseconds, I've got a lot more control. And then as I start to sweep up here, you can see that once I'm over 1 second here, we're just big values, tiny values. All right, so already we've got a pretty awesome synthesizer here. We're generating the tone at whatever note that we're specifying, and we've actually got it velocity sensitive at this point too. So if I jump back over here and I edit some of these velocities, let's make this one really loud. So we could call that good. We could say that's our synthesizer. Let's go get a beer, end of the day. But what we're really interested in here is generating a frequency modulation based synthesizer. So this is just the heart of it. So before we move on, let's clean things up a little bit so that we can start to organize things. So let's collapse this into, or encapsulate that inside of a subpatcher. So control or right click on it. I think we can do it in here somehow. Looks like maybe I've got to go up to Object. It's been a while since I've done it the long way. Edit, encapsulate. There we go. So edit menu, Command Shift or Shift Command E is going to encapsulate it. So let's do that. Command Shift E drops that inside of a subpatcher. Subpatchers are always identified by starting with a P, and we can give them a name just as kind of like a reminder of what's going on in there. MIDI data, and then if I lock my patch and I double click on that, you can see it actually opens up another patching window that contains the devices or the objects that I've encapsulated inside of that subpatcher, so our MIDI parse and our unpack, as well as an input and 2 outputs. So we're just kind of organizing things here based upon function. Then let's drag these guys over here, and let's encapsulate all of those together and call it our end generator. You'll notice that the sound of our synthesizer has gone back to being a very short envelope, and that is because when we encapsulate that, those are now new objects that have yet to have received any of the data from these dials. So just kind of, we'll have to resend all that information if we want to change any of that stuff. So just realigning that, something around there. And then let's encapsulate this. We probably should have stuck that inside of our MIDI data. Yeah, let's do that. So let's de-encapsulate this one. So let's go up to Edit, de-encapsulate, and re-encapsulate it with all of this stuff. Encapsulate MIDI data. Nice. And then let's put this one inside here. Maybe I should put that inside of there. It's good enough, whatever. So we've cleaned things up a little bit. And let's go ahead and stop our sequence there. So now what we want to do is we want to modulate the frequency of this oscillator with another oscillator, frequency modulation. So to do that, let's get another oscillator going. Let's bring it in here. And just for the time being, let's specify its frequency with a floatum box there, a floating value box. And let's translate this value into being, rather than just a max value, decimal point value, let's translate it into being a signal using the sig tilde object. So this is just going to turn this into a constant, non-time varying signal unless our sequence is running. So you can see that it's translated, it's switched from being a max cable there to an MSP patch cable down there at the bottom. We can exit out of there. Now if we disconnect that, reconnect it, you'll see we've got a cable there that's letting us know we're sending data there at our audio rate. So now we've got our frequency for this oscillator pumping out at audio rate at whatever we specify with those MIDI notes. So then let's take and let's modulate that by adding in another signal into that signal flow. So right now it's just 0 that's pumping in there. Get that running to confirm that it's still the same thing. Cool, still the same thing. And then let's take and add in a volume controlled oscillator there. So right now we've got frequency and volume of that oscillator, and add that into that right there. Get our sequence running again. Actually, let's get a new sequence that's just a G, and then let's take and multiply that out. So it's a whole bunch of measures long. So we've got a G3 here that's held out for like 129 measures. Get that one playing. Lovely. Jump back over, and now let's specify that this has a frequency of 1, and let's gradually bring up its amplitude. Let's actually connect up scopes to all of these so you can see and hear what's happening. And I actually think there's a nicer one. Let's go to the plots help menu, go to audio, and let's steal this one. So there's that one. There's that one. So now we can see there's our sine tone pumping out of there, and there's our modulating sine tone. It's right now just kind of wiggling up and down just a little bit. It's got a tiny amplitude. As we start to increase its amplitude, you can can see it moving up and down more and more. And you can see now that we've broken that rule that we've established where this is now louder than 1 or positive 1 and negative 1, but that's okay because we're not using it to plug in directly to our speakers. Instead, we're plugging it into a value that specifies the frequency of something. So this is just changing the frequency at which this thing is generating an oscillation back and forth between positive and negative 1. So by the time this comes out of this object down here, we still have a value that's between positive and negative 1. So sweeping this up, let's go bigger. Now we can hear frequency modulation. So what's happening here is we're taking a object which is producing a sine tone, so it's oscillating back and forth between positive and negative 1 out of this cycle object here, 1 time per second. But then we're multiplying that signal, it's going back and forth between positive and negative 1 by 1039. Let's make this an even 1000. So what that now means is rather than having a signal that's going back and forth between positive and negative 1 time per second, we have a signal that's going back and forth between positive 1000 and negative 1000 1 time per second as we multiply it by that value. Then we're taking that time varying positive negative 1000, pumping out of this here and adding that into our non-time varying value, which is a G3 I think it was. That's coming in here, so we're adding those two values together. So we've got the frequency of a G3 plus or minus 1000 hertz or 1000 1 time per second, just giving us this up and down. So we're going up 1000 from G3 and down 1000 from G3 1 time per second at the shape specified by our oscillator, so a sine tone here. Thus we have frequency modulation. Now the amplitude of our modulating oscillator specifies how much modulation is actually happening. So if I go down to 0, we've got no modulation. If I go to 10, now we're modulating the frequency up or down by 10 hertz. And then the frequency of our modulating oscillator is the rate at which that is happening. So how many times per second do we go up or down the value of our modulation index, or the amplitude of this? So how many times per second do we go up or down by 10? So as I start to increase that, let's jump up to a nice 100. So I start to increase our frequency. We gradually move out of this world of hearing it as vibrato, where we can actually track that G3 moving up or down. And now we're starting to hear it more and more as just the timbre. Let's make it more and more modulation. It's beautiful, isn't it? I love frequency modulation. So that's the basic idea of it. We've got one oscillator that is actually producing the end results, so the frequencies are the sounds that we hear. Then we've got another oscillator that we're not actually hearing, but all we're hearing is the influence or the amount of modulation that it has on the frequency of the oscillator that we actually are hearing. So let's clean up our patch a little bit. Let's get rid of those scopes, we don't need them. And now let's, rather than having these values be arbitrarily connected or arbitrary to the cycle or the frequency that we're actually producing, let's have those be related to the values or the MIDI notes that we've got coming in. So rather than going straight in, let's add in another signal multiplier object here. It's now producing a frequency of 0. And then let's connect up the frequency of our incoming MIDI note. And then let's add in another live dot dial. Call this one our mod freak, or maybe like our ratio. That's fine too. and then let's change its value to range from 0 to maybe 16 or 32, and let's unit style float, and initial, let's have its initial be 1, and exponent 1 is good for now. All right, let's leave it at that. We can connect that up here, set it to 1, and now as I get my sequence running, we've got specifying the frequency of our modulating oscillator as a relationship to that incoming MIDI note. So if I set it to 1, we've actually got the same exact frequency set for our modulating oscillator as our carrying oscillator is supposed to be specifying or creating. Then let's also have the amplitude of this be a relationship to our incoming MIDI note. So let's go another signal multiplying object, connect that up, and then let's add in another one and call this one our brightness, and 0 to 32 is cool for that one too. Connect that up. So how much modulation is happening, or how bright it is. And then maybe we want a second envelope generator so that it's not necessarily always modulating it, but rather we can change when that modulation is occurring. So let's option drag that whole bit, connect that up here, pump that into there, and then let's turn this into a trigger object and order the operations. So trigger sends out whatever information is coming in at the outputs we specify. So I wanted to send out this integer first to our, oops, I did this wrong. First to our envelope generator. So send in our velocity to the envelope generator, and then second, send our velocity along to our actual output. So this will get triggered first, and then this will get triggered second, within milliseconds of each other, but just want that to make sure that's happening. And then last but not least, we need to multiply our modulation signal by our envelope signal. So a few patch cords connected wrong here. Into that guy. So now I've got an envelope that's actually manipulating the output of my oscillator here, and then we can connect that up here. So now you can hear our cycle, or our carrier, has a separate envelope to the actual modulation envelope. So the world is really kind of limitless at this point. We're going to keep things simple, but just kind of throw some things at you. You can imagine that now we could change all of these values here so that they're not just stationary values, but we could actually add envelopes to those values as well, so that we're not just going constantly every time 2.01 is the relationship of our modulation frequency to our carrier frequency, but actually have that ramp up and down over time using an envelope. So not a small stretch of the imagination there to start to collide those two worlds together, but let's keep it simple. So this is going to be the basis of our sound generation thing here. So let's do some cleaning here. Let's collect all this together, encapsulate it, call this as our modulator, and make sure that everything's kind of pretty here. That's cool that that's going there. That's fine that that's going there. maybe just do a little bit of routings here. I'll stretch this out. Boom. And then arrange, distribute horizontally. Something like that. Then let's make sure this is nice and tidy. That looks good, that looks good. I love things to be nicely organized here. So let's tidy that there. Put that there. And let's move all this down a bit here. Oops, it slipped. Like so. Command Y to route some of these patch cables. Let's route this one. Move that down a bit. Route this one. That down a bit. Let's route this one. Let's route all these. All right, looking fairly tidy. So now we've got a synthesizer here that will produce whatever tone we've specified here. Let's jump back over. And we can already start creating some really complex things. Let's turn this into something we can actually work with inside of Ableton. So to do that, let's go through and let's highlight all the things that we actually need to touch in order to make this sound work. Oops, holding Shift. Those are all of our user interface objects that we actually need to touch. Then let's right click or control click on it, go down to add to presentation. So in Max, there's two windows. There is our edit window and our presentation window. So if I add these to presentation, you'll see they all get highlighted or kind of glow that reddish color. And then if I switch over from my edit window to the presentation mode, you'll see it gets rid of everything that I didn't tell Max to add to the presentation window. And now I can actually move these bits about. So let's add in our attack over here, and then our modulation beneath that, and then our ratio and our brightness. And then maybe let's turn this into, rather than being vertical, let's switch this to being horizontal. Stick that over here, maybe line these guys up like so. And then let's slide things over just a little bit, add in a comment box using C to create a comment box, and then type in carrier. Command J will truncate that box to the length of the text that's been entered into it. Add another one in there, call this one our modulator. Command J to truncate that one. Line both of those up. Looks like we need to slide things over just a little bit. There we go. Then the last thing is, you'll notice that if I switch back over to my presentation or my edit window, that vertical limit line is still in my edit window and not in my presentation window. So to get that, I'll go into my inspector. Oops. Since I don't have any objects currently selected, there's nothing in my inspector, so I need to switch over to editing or show the patcher inspector, so the inspector for this patch itself. And then we're going to go down, find somewhere in here, we'll find view, and then underneath that, open in presentation. So if I click that, first thing you'll notice is that that vertical limit line shows up here. And what this means is now when we open up this patcher, rather than opening by default to the edit window, it's going to open by default to the presentation window, which is where we made everything look all pretty. So let's slide everything down here. And let's lock our patch, Command E, and then let's actually save this for the first time. We probably should have saved a long time ago in case something happened and I wanted to be able to recall this. We should have done that, but let's do it for the first time. So let's do Command S, and then let's save this into a place where it's going to go. Mine is by default going into my instrument presets, Max Instruments, and you can see all the stuff that I've made in Max for Live there. And I'm going to name this as my DRD Simple FM Synth. And I like to give mine version numbers 2016.06. What is today's date? The 27th, 27.version 01. So if I make more versions of this, it's easy for me to jump back to editing a previous version of this. So there's my patch, save, and then we can Command S again, and then W to close it out. jump back over into live, and now you can see we've got this pretty little device in here that is playable inside of live. So now if I beautiful. Maybe create a return track, dump onto that return track some reverb, go fully wet on that reverb, nice long, let's go high quality, and then send some of my signal to that. And we also need some delay, so let's add some maybe some ping pong delay onto another return track. Go fully wet with that one. Good amount of feedback, 3 is good. And let's also add some reverb to that delay, so let's enable our send to send A, crank that all the way up, and now we get, oops, we've got to send. Oh, it's beautiful. So now the thing that we're all always wanting is, great, I've got these really cool sounds. Yes, it sounds awesome with reverb. Yes, it sounds really cool with some ping pong delay on there, but I want to play more notes. I can press down as many as I want or program in something that should play lots of notes and trigger that. And it's creating a really complex sound, but it's only playing one of those notes. So we need to go polyphonic. This isn't too hard, but I promise you the first times you try to do it, you'll run into problems, and we're probably going to run into problems while we try and accomplish this, because it always seems to be a little bit finicky. You know, it's expecting things in certain ways, in certain orders, and I don't always get it right. So let's get it right together, let's stumble through it together, and let's turn this into translate this from being just a monophonic frequency modulation synth into a polyphonic frequency modulation synth, so we can have all the goodness of playing many, 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 many notes. So let's crack this back open, turn to our editor. Here's our patch. Let's take and, oops, we've got some kind of hanging Command J there to truncate those. Let's move this down over here, carrier, modulator. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to kind of cut out of this patch all of the bits that make it work, and copy those into another patch that will then later load up inside of a new object called the polytilde object, which allows us to call up many instances of a single patch, as many as we want, and thus we get polyphony. So let's copy this. We need all this stuff here. Is that how I want to do this? I think this is how I want to do it. We might have to come back and change this. But let's take, and I've highlighted all the bits that make it work, and then let's copy it. Let's create a new patcher. And then let's copy that in here, paste. Actually, what would have been easier first is if over in this patcher, with all those selected, if I'd encapsulated those all first, encapsulate. Cool, let's edit a little bit more. Let's take and let's drop into a POC object. So there's two types of objects that allow us to collect multiple streams of data into one stream of a list of data, and that is either the PAC object or the POC object, the only difference being CK or K there. The PAC object, what's unique about this one is it's not going to pass along the data that it's receiving until the leftmost inlet changes. So this is really good if I've got all this data and I don't want it to send until the last bit of data is received. But if I want it to always be sending out, regardless of which piece of information has been received, I use the POC object. So it's going to always, when any one of them changes, it's going to pass that data along. So let's use the pack. Let's provide it with some arguments. I'm going to be connecting up these dials here. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dials there. So let's specify that it's going to be receiving or expecting to receive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 floating point objects, or floating point bits of data. That's hence the F's there stand for floating point. Then let's connect up each of these. Drag it over here. You're not going to let me? Fine. Do it this way, long way. Decay comes out of that one. Sustain, remember to grab that from the raw value rather than the displayed value. And last but not least, our release. There we go. And then we're going to unpack all that data. I know this seems redundant, but I promise I'll explain. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Unpack all that data back into its respective expected locations. Like so. Did I get that right? So these two go in here. Then that one. Yep. So the reason that I'm doing this is so that once we encapsulate all this stuff, we'll only have to use one inlet to specify or send all of the data to our modulating oscillator. And we're going to do the same thing for our carrier's envelope here. So let's create a new POC object. This one only expects 4 floats. A new unpack object that does the same, unpacks 4. Connect those 2 up. Then let's option drag to grab each of these, connect it up there, then replace each of those here. Then align these connections. Click. Stretch this out. Reroute that patch cable, Command Y. And maybe slide all this down just a little bit. Oops. There we go. So now when I go back and I select this patch, this one, this guy, and this guy, and this guy, so leaving all the things that I touch plus these POC objects out of my selection there, as well as leaving the MIDI in and the plugin not selected. And then I encapsulate those, Command-Shift-E, or go up to Edit, where was it? Edit, Encapsulate. So I'm going to drop all those inside of a subpatcher just like we've done before. And now you can see I've only got 3 inlets. I've got my MIDI inlet, my carrier's envelope inlet, and my modulator's stuff there. So what that's done is it's extremely simplified the amount of connections that I need to have into this. And let's rename this as my FM Synth. Stretch that back out. Cool. Let's see what's inside of there. Lock our patch, double click on it. There's what's inside of our patch. It actually looks pretty tidy. It's not too messy. So now this is what we can take and copy and paste into a new patcher. So let's exit out of that one, create our new patcher, paste it into there. And we want to be able to save this as a patcher that we can then load up inside of our poly object, poly tilde object, which is going to allow us to go polyphonic. So if you're still scratching your head, hang with me. I promise that once we look back at all these steps, it's going to make sense as to why we've done all this. So we need to alter our patch just a little bit so that when we load this up inside of a poly object, it works. The biggest thing is that we need to switch out these inlets for the types of inlets that the poly object likes, and that is the in. And they're all max messages for inlets. We can just call this one in1, and then replace this connection here, delete that inlet, create another one, in2, connect this one up here, delete that out of there, and then in3, connect that one up there. And we only have one outlet, but it's sending out a signal, so we do out tilde 1, connect that up there, and close that out of there. So then the only other bit that we need to do here is we need to know when, so we're going to be loading up multiple copies of this patch. So we want to be able to play 16 simultaneous notes. We're going to tell our poly tilde object to load up 16 copies of this patch. But then the poly tilde object needs to know which one of those patches or which one of those voices is currently being used, so that if we ask it to create another note, it will use a different or an unused version of this patch. So to do that, we're going to go into our carrier's envelope generator. Let's tidy this up a little bit. Command J to make that. Sometimes when we copy and paste, things get shortened strangely. And we're going to add in this ADSR envelope is perfect for the job because it's actually meant for connecting up to or use inside of a poly tilde object. So we're going to load up this poly object, which is responsible for reporting to the poly tilde object that this poly object is inside of, and reporting whether or not it thinks it's being used or not. So if we create that, it's only got one inlet that's expecting a mute message or whether or not it's busy or not. So if we connect up the mute outlet of the ADSR object, that will confirm whether or not this ADSR object is currently generating an envelope, and this is creating the actual volume output of our synth. So if it's busy, if it's generating an envelope, it'll say, hey, I'm in use. If it's not generating an envelope, it'll tell this poly tilde object, hey, I'm not in use, so you can use me. And just to be sure, let's also connect up the signal output from this envelope generator, which remember is ramping from 0 to 1 or whatever our velocity calls for, and back to 0. So if it's ever at a greater value than 0, it'll tell this poly tilde object, hey, I'm currently generating an envelope, and when it's not generating an envelope, it'll go back to 0, and it'll tell this poly tilde object, hey, I'm not making an envelope, so you can use me. All right, let's resize that window, exit out of there, and let's save this patch. Let's save it somewhere that our poly tilde object can find it. So let's go to the desktop. Let's call this one the DRD Poly FM version 01 for the day. Let's also copy that file name, and then let's save it. And then if we go back to our patcher, first thing we want to make sure is that Max is actually looking at our desktop. So let's go Option, File Preferences, and see that one of the user paths here is actually pointing to the desktop. So here's my Macintosh users, my user account, and my desktop, and it's also searching all subfolders. If it wasn't there, I could add a path and tell it to look at that desktop. Or if you're already saving your patches in a location like your Dropbox or something like that, you can point Max towards that location. The important thing is that Max knows to look for where this file is so we can load it up inside of a poly tilde object. So now if I come back to our Max for Live patch, create a new object, call it the poly tilde patch. It's going to take an argument, which is which patch do you actually want to load in here. Since I copy and pasted that name when I was saving our previous file, the DRD Poly FM version 01, I can just paste it in there. Then the next argument is how many instances of that patch do you want this poly tilde object to load up. So let's say 16. 16 voices. And loads up. We should see our 3 inlets. Double click on it. There's actually the object inside of it. Then we need to send a few messages to this thing to get it started. So let's create a load bang object, which will send out a bang every time the patch loads up. And I think we need to send out the messages of target 0 and voice. Actually, let's just do target 0. Connect that up. And what that specifies is that when this patch loads up, we're telling it all the information that we're sending to you, target all of the instances of the patches that are loaded inside of it. We could alter this and say, actually don't target everybody, just target this number instance of that patch, 0 through 15. I'm sorry, 1 through 16 would give us the ability to target specific ones if we needed to change just one voice, for example. Rarely do I need to do that. Then we can connect up our envelope information here. Just switching all these over. Our output. There we go. And then we also need to prepend our incoming MIDI note. Let's see, does it tell me somewhere? Again, obnoxiously loud. Note instances. For some reason, I don't think that note was what we wanted. All right, we might have to play a little bit. MIDI note, and then connect this in there, and then connect that in there. So there's some step in here that we need to, before the MIDI information, so the raw MIDI information that we're passing into there, we need to tell it that this is actually MIDI information that it's receiving. So there's some special command that needs to precede that so that the poly object actually knows what it's receiving. But let's see, maybe we've got it here. So let's put this over here, slide this all in line, stretch this back out, send in our target 0, respecify all of this information, and see if we're getting information. Nope. All right, find out why. Let's try changing here to note. Nothing. All right, let's go look at a previous one that I've built. Let's look at the Fat Molly. Freeze, unlock. Okay, so in this case I've got the MIDI parse actually outside, and then it says MIDI note. Interesting. Let's see what happens if I just go straight in. It's really loud. Let's see, do we have polyphony? Nope, not that one. This one, please. Let's go no modulation. Nope. All right, so let's change our patch a little bit. Let's go change this into MIDI note, and then let's go open our recent, our Poly FM, and let's extract out. Let's see, how did I do this? So it goes MIDI in, MIDI parse, and then only passing along that information. Got it. All right, so with our object here, let's copy this bit here, change this into an unpack, turn that into a signal. So we're actually going to be receiving in this inlet the MIDI note and the velocity. We're going to turn velocity, or the MIDI note, send it in there, and then the velocity will go in here, and we can disconnect that guy. Now we should have essentially the same looking thing. Put it in there, then copy this guy, delete it out of there, save it, close it, punch it in here, and let's see, so this should be disconnected, and we should have MIDI parse, and take that pitch velocity, patch it in there. And now let's reload our patcher. Resend all the information. Jump back over to live. jump up. Let's try target 0. See, it's never just, I mean, maybe if I was a wizard at this stuff, it would work every time, but I'm not a wizard. Still not working. Why not? Load mesh target 0, which passes into that guy. Let's add in the attribute of steel 1, which is just going to tell this guy that if you run out of available patches, I've asked you to produce more than 16 notes simultaneously, you'll steal the oldest one in order to make the newest one. But let's also see if there's anything else inside of here that should be there. So unpack this poly. That's blatantly obvious. We've forgotten our MIDI to frequency inside of our patcher. We're just going straight from the MIDI note to our cycle object. So let's go new object MTOF. Slide that in here. Click. Beautiful. Save it. Reload our patcher just by respecifying it. Send in our messages. Huzzah! We've got polyphony. So then we can collapse this back down, hit save, close it out, get rid of our reference patch there, close all those things out, don't save that one, jump back over into live, and now we've got let's start to bring in some modulation. Those glitches are just because my screen recording software is running right now. So it's actually, let's give live a little bit more time to make these things happen. And then let's have a nice long attack on our modulator there. Add in some reverb. Add in some delay. Thanks for watching, and as always, I hope this video helps you not only unlock and understand your tools, but also inspires you to create and share. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it, share it with your community, and subscribe to my channel to hear about all my future videos. If you have any questions, feel free to comment below or send me an email via my website, which you can find linked in this video's description. Thanks!